My name's Dr Cameron Langfield. I'm a criminologist here at UOW. Criminology is really the study of crime. It's not forensic psychology. It's not criminal profiling that you might see on Criminal Minds and FBI shows. It's really the study of why people commit crime, how we might help them to desist or stop offending, and also helps us to understand why people might re-offend, or what we call recidivate, how we might prevent that from happening in the modern day world. Today we're going to be reacting to some crime depictions in everyday shows that we've all watched.
I sat there for hours taking it all in, piecing together her whole timeline. Her graduate job, how she got fired for inappropriate behavior with the boss, how she started hanging around outside his house, then falsely reporting him to the police for abusing his disabled child. This other time she attacked his mother in the street, her 4.5-year prison sentence. I had a convicted stalker stalking me. I had a convicted stalker stalking me.
I think this is the moment we all collectively screamed at the screen and we're like, don't do it, don't do it. And yet, he goes and does it. I suppose in this case, that it does seem that this is the first person that's making him feel special or making him feel like he's worth something, I guess. In Australia, 1 in 15 men and 1 in, I think it was 5 women had reported that they'd been stalked by someone since the age of 15. So it is a very common occurrence, I think. Oftentimes these people don't do anything to provoke this. It's primarily in the offender's psychology, I suppose, that really is, they latch on to someone. There's this pervasive narrative in society that stalking and domestic and family violence doesn't happen to men. Obviously it happens to women more often, but it does indeed happen to men as well. Perhaps he's thinking that, you know, she's a harmless middle-aged woman and, you know, she's just looking for a friend. This is a real experience that this person went through. It's difficult to sort of see, but I think probably in his mind he's thinking, oh, it'll be okay, I can control this. I'll be the exception to the rule.
I'm about to monologue, son. I'm Philip, a successful periodontist that's become addicted to diazepam, a sedative I take because I'm junkie scum. Also, for real, addiction is a disease I would be super empathetic if you hadn't murdered a man.
What is the point of this?
I'll get there. So, one day I'm working late when my boss Robert surprises me. He found out I was stealing meds. Again, junkie scum. Also, again, not your fault, there's a major genetic component to addiction.
So I think there is this common misconception that addiction is a choice. Now, in the last 20 years, there has really been a flip in the nature of drug dependency. Recently, obviously in the US with the opioid epidemic, has obviously shown that, you know, high upstanding members or upstanding members, quote unquote, of society can actually be battling, you know, addiction as well. The fact that, you know, Jake was saying, oh, just kidding, you know, it's a genetic thing. I think it's quite interesting. He's sort of thinking to himself, oh, that's quite an outdated and old way of thinking. And I suppose that's a good thing to see, that, you know, turning the corner, I suppose, that it is now being more recognized as a physiological state rather than a choice.
You got lucky. You were in the surgical suite. It can be sterilized. You never would have gotten away with it in your carpeted office.
That's not what happened.
Don't say anything more, Philip.
And your office manager would have heard all of the screaming, but she was at her grandson's play. Lucky again.
You're wrong.
You put Robert's body into a wheelchair and shoved it in the elevator.
I also think at this point he's been interrogated for what, 24 hours? I think there's definitely a concern of a false confession in this instance.
Lucky at every turn!
No, I knew exactly where I was driving. I left my phone in the office on purpose. I was in a surgical suite by design, and I didn't use some glass award that any idiot would clearly see was missing. I made a rod out of a special dental polymer, killed him with it, then melted it back down. It's already in a patient's mouth, son!
I think this is a brilliant clip because it showcases the very lengthy process that police go through to investigate a suspect, but I also think it shows false confessions in that case. False confessions can obviously then lead to actual convictions. The case that I'm thinking of most recently in New South Wales is the case of Catherine Folbig, who was falsely imprisoned for the murder of her 3 children, and that has now been reversed, and she's in the process of being compensated.
Did you know you had the wrong murder weapon?
Excellent question, sir. Yes. I spotted the missing dental award when I first took the case. I asked around weeks ago. Turns out a cleaning lady knocked it over and shattered it.
Then why did you run in there like that?
Because in talking to you, I realized what Philip's worst fear actually was. That we would think he was just some dummy that got lucky.
Right. He had planned the perfect crime, and it killed him when you said he was sloppy and impulsive.
He needed us to know how smart he was.
Right.
Like someone else I know.
Yep. Kevin.
There is definitely a stereotype that these people need to show off how intelligent they are, and I think that's a very common trope that you see in shows like Criminal Minds, and in particular this show and Mindhunter. That is probably a very small subset of the actual offender population that comes to the attention of police and therefore in the attention of the criminal justice system. Most offending is actually what we would call needs-based offending, and that is crime that's being committed by people who have a particular need, such as stealing food for a family. The vast majority of people who come to the attention of the criminal justice system do come from disadvantaged backgrounds. But I do think that there are people like that do need to show off in that sense, and I think that probably extends to the criminal side of things as well. I think the choice of music in this clip is particularly interesting.
Hank, do you think I might get to go inside? See the actual lab?
Yeah, tell you what, we're gonna go peek our heads in, check it out first. Stay here a minute.
Oh my God. Pinkman? Why are you here? I was curious. Honestly, I never expected you to amount to much, but methamphetamine? But you know the business. And I know the chemistry. I'm thinking maybe you and I could partner up.
I think this clip also illustrates something important about the nature of criminal offending. I suppose the value of mentoring in criminal relationships. Mentoring can actually occur from criminal to criminal, and that in this case, I suppose offering to partner up and also then potentially mentor him into being a better criminal in that sense. And I think that mentoring relationship, or what we might call a criminogenic relationship, becomes very prominent in the series.
You want to cook crystal meth? You and me.
That's right.
Wow.
Either that, or I turn you in.
And you also then obviously have coercion, coercing Jesse, obviously, he's going to turn him in, or, we can join him. And I think, Walter's probably got a number of motivations. For those of you who haven't seen the show, Walter has just been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he turns to criminal offending in order to support his family. The other thing about Breaking Bad that's quite interesting, he obviously starts out on a moral high ground. He's doing this as a pro-social thing in his mind. And then almost it sort of develops into a pattern of behavior. And I think primarily that's because he starts to see this as the only way that he can get ahead. This was a popular idea in America in the late 40s when Robert Merton was really talking about this idea of strain, that people will fall into criminal opportunities and criminal ways of being because pro-social means are no longer accessible to them, but they are still living, or they're still hoping for the American dream of, white picket fence, big house, couple of pets, couple of kids. And so Robert Merton was really interested in this interplay with what happens when people still hold the idea of having the American dream or the Australian dream, in whatever case it may be, but are actually not able to achieve that through legal and pro-social means. And he would argue that they would fall into criminal offending and criminal behavior to still obtain the American dream.
Killed those 3 Wall Street guys.
Telling us you killed those 3 young men on the subway?
Mm-hmm.
And why should we believe you?
I got nothing left to lose. Nothing can hurt me anymore.
You've almost got this learned
My
helplessness
life
from
is
the Joker
nothing
in
but
this
a
scene.
comedy.
Well, let me get this straight. You think that killing those guys is funny?
I do. And I'm tired of pretending it's not. Comedy is subjective, Murray. Isn't that what they say? All of you, the system that knows so much, you decide what's right or wrong. The same?
I think there's a number of things in this scene that are interesting, in particular just this first little bit, when he mentions the system decides what's funny and what's not. And I think it's an interesting point to be made around systemic issues that we face. The fact that he's referencing here the system, you know, we have systems of punishment in this country. 44,000 people I think were in prison, and I think 41% of them were on remand in the last year. Yeah, it's interesting that he's talking here about systems of punishment and systems of behavior, and that this guy feels, I suppose, oppressed by a system that's not designed for people like him.
The same way that you decide what's funny or not.
Well, okay, I think I might understand that you did this to start a movement, to become a symbol.
Come on, Murray. Do I look like the kind of clown that could start a movement? I killed those guys because they were awful. Everybody is awful these days. It's enough to make anyone crazy.
Okay, so that's it. You're crazy. That's your defense for killing 3 young men?
I also think there's an interesting point to be made here about it's enough to make anyone crazy. You know, that's, I suppose, a trope that we see a lot in crime shows, that oh, it wasn't me, it was the system. You know, I had no other choice. And I think that that's something that us as criminologists, I think we deal with, you know, or we tackle relatively often about how do we balance the competing demands of rehabilitation but also punishment. How do we make sure that people know that this is the wrong thing to do versus how do we actually rehabilitate them into, hopefully, pro-social and law-abiding citizens.
If it was me dying on the sidewalk, you'd walk right over me. I pass you every day and you don't notice me. But these guys, what, because Thomas Wayne went
There's an interesting commentary on disadvantage and
yes, I do.
personal circumstances in this
Have
movie.
you seen what it's like out there, Murray? Do you ever actually leave the studio?
And I think it's important to realize that
Everybody
we don't always
yells,
experience society in the
screams
same
at
ways.
each other.
I think there's
Nobody's civil
different
anymore.
levels of
Nobody thinks
privilege
what it's
and different
like
levels
to be
of
the
disadvantage
underdog.
that we all face.
You think men like Thomas Wayne ever think what it's like to be someone like me? To be somebody but themselves? They don't. They think that we'll just sit there and take it like good little boys, that we won't werewolf and go wild.
You finished? I mean, there's so much self-pity, Arthur.
It's almost interesting in this scene because you have the Joker talking about the reasons for his behavior, and then you almost have Robert De Niro's character who's acting as society in this instance. He's sort of, all I'm hearing is self-pity, you know, all I'm hearing is excuses.
Jokes.
What do you get
I don't think so.
when you cross
I think
a
we're
mentally
done
ill
with your
loner
jokes.
with
That's
a
it.
society that abandons him and treats him like
I
trash?
think he said a couple of things that are interesting. One is that he says, what do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that treats him like trash, essentially? I think there's an interesting trope here that's being played, that people that are mentally ill are violent in that sense, or will act in ways that are depicted in like this. That's a very common trope that I think we see in a lot of crime shows. In fact, it's not exactly accurate. I think the vast majority of people with mental health struggles are not violent, and they don't end up in the criminal justice system. I think this is, as I said, a really good depiction of a number of things. I think, you know, there's obviously the mental health problems that the Joker has, but also the wider comment on society and how they treat people that are different. You've got the riot squad, you've got a fire burning in the backyard, and here comes the matron.
Mr. Jackson?
Emma?
And there's B. Now B is interesting because she has worked her way up from essentially the newest inmate to being the top dog or the top prisoner. And having watched a bit of this show, I think it is quite realistic. And I think it's interesting, the display of her power. Just with a single hand up, just say, stop.
Well, you haven't called in the squad. You don't know I haven't. And let the world know you've lost control of this place. It was never gonna happen. I can put a stop to this now. Tell the women to back off, put down their weapons, send them back to the units. Or we can just stay here, hang out, until you're forced to call the squad. It's up to you. What do you want? No repercussions for anyone involved here today. And anything that affects the women in the future, you run it by me first. You don't run this prison. I do.
I think that's such a fantastic way of encapsulating the power dynamic that's changed. It's interesting because it sort of flipped the power dynamic in what happens in real life, I guess. Oftentimes we hear about the power dynamic of, prison guards run the prison and they can control what prisoners have access to and the privileges and that sort of thing. But in some cases, obviously, as we see here, that we have, prisoners can exert their power over prisoners, but also prison guard management. I suppose with anything, there's a negative and a positive when it comes to these types of relationships. I think depictions in crime TV shows, you often see the prison guard and prisoner relationship is portrayed as negative, but in actual fact, there's quite a lot of literature out there that actually shows that it can be quite a positive experience and quite a positive relationship. But I do think it depends on the people involved. We often hear about prison guards abusing their power and committing quite heinous crimes against the prisoners. And I think that's it's an interesting dynamic that can go either way. We often do see that hierarchy of of gangs and stuff in prison. We do see a bit of a trope. I do think there is some truth to it. Youth detention centers in particular are often referred to as universities of crime. Impressionable young people can be brought into a system and brought into an institution that actually can lead to them learning criminal techniques and criminal behaviors, and actually coming out and actually being a more serious offender, a more experienced offender, a more knowledgeable offender. That was something that the early 60s and 70s in criminology was really interested in, because there was a sort of a growth in this idea that criminal behavior could be learnt. In the same way that we learn pro-social behaviors, criminal behavior could be learned through imitation and through differential association with our peers, and that peer relationship is equally as important when talking about young people, but also adults as well. That old adage of the company you keep are the people that reflect who you are. So I don't think it's far off the mark. Thanks so much for watching. At UOW, we have a host of experts who can comment on all of your favorite TV shows or movies. So if you have any ideas, please leave them in the comments below. Some good news: over the last 20 years, crime, as much as TV shows and movies would have you otherwise believe, crime is actually down internationally and in Australia. And we're not really being overrun by youth gangs on the street. And if you want to know more, please Google UOW Bachelor of Criminology, in which the new course starting this year is going to be talking about a whole host of these issues in more detail. Thanks again.